Something remarkable is unfolding across Africa, and yet few in the West truly grasp the depth of this change. For from the arid lands of the Sahel to the bustling coastal ports of West Africa, a storm of sovereignty is rising, not with violence, but with vision, a storm whose thunder echoes in the words of young leaders, in the chants of street rallies, and even in the silence of governments quietly saying no. For decades, African nations were told there was only one way to develop except the loans. Privatize your assets, liberalize your markets, and hope that prosperity would trickle down like drops of water from the hands of foreign benefactors. But today, those assumptions are being challenged in the boldest ways seen in generations. With the World Bank and the IMF, long considered the lifelines for struggling economies, now facing open rejection, and leading this quiet revolution is a man from one of the world's poorest nations who is standing taller than any financial. Skyscraper Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, who in a bold and unprecedented move refused a lucrative loan package, not because his country didn't need the funds, but because the cost wasn't just financial, it was a piece of his people's future. And this act of defiance is about much more than Burkina Faso. It is about an entire continent waking up, remembering its strength, and choosing a different path, a path of dignity rather than dependence. And yet the question remains, will this rebellion against dependency succeed, or will the weight of the old system crush it once again? Is the world ready to accept a self-reliant Africa, or will it fight to keep the status quo intact? And most importantly, are Africans themselves prepared to pay the price of real independence? These questions echo across villages and capitals, for something is shifting. And for the first time in generations, it feels as though the ground is moving in Africa's favor. The silence before the storm is over. And now the world must listen, because in the heart of West Africa, under the blistering sun and the weight of a painful colonial past, one decision sent shockwaves through the continent. For when the World Bank presented Burkina Faso with a new financial package promising development funds in exchange for familiar austerity policies and deep structural adjustments, President Ibrahim Traoré stood before his people and said no, not with hesitation, not with apology, but with a calm certainty that echoed far beyond Ouagadougou. The package on the table was filled with glittering promises: infrastructure, access to foreign reserves, and what the bank called a roadmap to modernization. But to Traoré, it looked like another form of control, a Trojan horse dressed as salvation. For inside were demands to privatize national assets, eliminate subsidies for agriculture and energy, and swallow the same bitter medicine that had hollowed out so many African economies in the past, leaving them perpetually in debt. And so his response was clear and deliberate: Burkina Faso will chart its own path. This was not an impulsive rejection, but the product of years of frustration, years of watching how each loan came with invisible chains, how each reform package dismantled state capacity, and how every agreement widened the gap between the people and their prosperity. Traoré, still in his 30s, represents the restless heartbeat of Africa's youth. Millions under the age of 30, who have grown up watching their countries remain poor, despite being rich in resources. And so his refusal was not just economic. It was political, philosophical, even spiritual. It was a break with the illusion that development could be imported or outsourced. For decades, African nations had danced to the rhythm of foreign creditors, adjusting their policies to fit someone else's model. But the music is changing. And when Traoré said no, he wasn't just refusing money, he was refusing submission. His administration made it clear that any future development would be built on internal capacity, local ownership, and policies aligned with the needs of Burkina's citizens, not the desires of international investors. Within days, analysts across the globe reacted with disbelief. Why would a nation so in need of funds turn away such support? But those asking that question missed the deeper truth. For Burkina Faso wasn't turning away support, It was turning away manipulation, and Traoré's message carried a resonance across Africa. True sovereignty begins with economic independence. And on social media, in Pan-African forums, and in university classrooms, young Africans cited his stance as a moment of clarity, a spark of hope. For the first time in years, a leader had defied the financial orthodoxy, not just with words, but with action. And his decision reignited historical memories of figures like Thomas Sankara, who once declared that the hand that feeds you controls you, now decades later, was applying that principle to the 21st century in his rejection of the world. Banks' package was not only an act of economic sovereignty, but also a public critique of the development narrative imposed on Africa for generations. For these loans, dressed in the language of reform and growth, often undermined sovereignty, forcing governments to prioritize debt payments over healthcare, education, and infrastructure, while opening the door for foreign companies to extract resources and leave little for local communities. And so his message was simple, yet revolutionary: Burkina Faso will no longer trade dignity for dollars. This act of defiance did not go unnoticed. It challenged not only the policies of financial institutions, but also the assumptions of those who believed African nations had no choice but to comply. It suggested there is another way, one that starts not with external approval, but with internal conviction. Whether this path leads to success or hardship remains to be seen, but the act itself marked a turning point, a statement of intent. And in a world accustomed to African silence, Burkina Faso had found its voice, and the ripple effect of Traoré's decision spread like fire through dry grass, awakening old memories and igniting new aspirations. For many, it wasn't just a rejection of aid, it was a declaration of war against economic servitude in Bamako, in Addis Ababa, in Lagos. Young people whispered a name they had heard only in history books: Thomas Sankara, the man who 4 decades earlier transformed Upper Volta into Burkina Faso with a vision rooted in dignity, discipline, and self-reliance. A man who refused IMF loans, banned ministerial luxury, made the nation food self-sufficient, and paid for his convictions with his life. And now his ideological heir had emerged, not in name, but in action. And the continent was watching, but the institutions. Traoré defied are not accustomed to being ignored. Within days, Western media circulated headlines warning of instability, questioning Burkina Faso's competence, and painting the rejection as reckless. Panels filled with experts, many who had never set foot in Africa, declared it naive. Yet beneath the surface, a different narrative was taking shape across Pan-African networks, diaspora blogs, and grassroots forums. The move was seen as courage, a vision of sovereignty rediscovered, and other African governments took notice. In Mali, where leaders were re-evaluating debt, Traoré's act was validation. In Ethiopia, it was encouragement. In Congo and Ghana, activists demanded transparency in foreign agreements. And suddenly, the assumption that no African leader would dare reject the World Bank was broken. The emotional shift was seismic. For Africans long accustomed to feeling powerless against global financial machinery, now saw leaders standing tall, not with slogans, but with policies. And this pride matters more than any model. It is the difference between a generation growing up believing the answers must come from the outside, and one that believes the answers lie within, yet the risks are real. Burkina Faso now stands on a collision course with powerful interests. Aid may shrink, investments may slow, sanctions may appear, but this is not about comfort. It is about conviction. And leaders like Traoré are willing to endure short-term pain for long-term sovereignty, and their people, weary of broken promises, increasingly stand with them. The rejection marks the climax of a long struggle fought not with weapons, but with memory, data, and political will, a moment where the old narrative cracks and something new emerges. Whether it survives will depend on alliances, reforms, and grassroots support. But its emotional impact is already irreversible. The fear that once silenced voices is gone, replaced with a calm but fierce belief that Africa can choose its future. And that choice begins with the courage to say no. The shockwaves did not stop at elites. They reached into neighborhoods, markets, and classrooms, where street vendors, farmers, and students felt for the first time their government was listening to them, not to Washington or Brussels. Though consequences followed slowed aid, warnings of inflation, murmurs of isolation, something powerful was building. Ownership, debates in universities, murals in streets, cooperatives discussing domestic models, women leading cooperatives, rejecting microfinance debt traps, and promoting collective investment, youth in tech hubs embracing innovation as sovereignty, policymakers in Congo asking why wealth should leave while poverty stays, leaders revisiting contracts, and across the Sahel, sovereignty was no longer a slogan but a practical goal. Radio hosts, civil society groups, and farmers all asked the same question. Why must Africa trade dignity for debt? Why should the future be mortgaged to outsiders? And in that asking lay the true revolution, not only against financial servitude, but against the colonial mindset that dependency was inevitable, and